Paul Vario went down in history as one of the most mysterious and influential mobsters. His life of crime, full of unexpected twists and turns, served as a source of inspiration for Hollywood screenwriters. Vario became the prototype for the character in the cult movie Goodfellas, where he was shown as a calm and patient man. But in reality, Paul was quite different, and his real story is even more fascinating. And if you're interested in hearing it, then meet Paul Vario. Paul Vario was born on July 9, 1914 in New York City. He grew up in South Brooklyn in the Old Mill District. This place is known for its large Italian community and high crime rate. His parents, Vito and Maria Vario, were Italian immigrants. Paul was known to have 4 brothers, one of whom was also involved in criminal activity and was linked to the Lucchese mafia family. Paul began his criminal path at the age of 11 when he found himself in the dock for systematic truancy from school. At the end of the session, he earned his first real term, 7 months in a children's correctional colony. It's easy to guess that Paul Vario's troubles with the law didn't stop after his prison term. After his release from prison, he was involved in petty robbery, hooliganism, hijacking, and a host of other crimes. However, he managed to avoid punishment for a long time. Paul's first serious trouble with the law began when he was 22 years old, September 13, 1936. 16-year-old Frances and her friend Millie were sitting in a parked car near the church where the girls had just recently finished the service. 2 men approached their car. After a brief conversation, one of the perpetrators pulled out a gun. The men ordered the girl to get out of the car. Obeying the demand, Frances left the car, which did not help her to avoid a sad fate. That afternoon, the girl was taken to the Howard Beach neighborhood where Paul and 4 of his friends raped and beat the victim. Surprisingly, after the abuse, they allowed Frances to leave, leaving her alive, which set in motion further events. For an agonizing year, the victim of the torture could not overcome her fear to go to the police. At some point, however, the pain of the experience became so unbearable that she decided to seek help. Together with her friend, who was not harmed by the attackers on that unfortunate day and witnessed the kidnapping, they wrote a report of rape. The description of the perpetrators was exhaustive. The identities of 2 of them were established the same day. Thanks to the detailed accounts of the criminal's appearance, the police were able to identify Paul Vario and Anthony Romano. A short while later, both defendants in the case were in custody and were taken to court for justice. However, not everything went smoothly. The story generated a great deal of interest in the local press, largely due to the fact that the hearing was repeatedly postponed. The reason for several postponements were countless threats against the girls themselves, other witnesses, and their relatives. Millie testified in court that friends of Paul Vario threatened her, saying they would kill her if she confirmed the identities of the perpetrators. The witness hesitated for a long time as she was constantly sent anonymous notes threatening to kill her and her family. Despite their extreme anxiety and fear for their lives, Millie and Frances confirmed in court that Paul Vario and Anthony Romano were the perpetrators of the crime. In addition to them, 3 other men participated in the rape and torture, but the victim could not remember their faces or identify them. The outcome of this high-profile trial was a real sentence for both defendants. The judge sentenced them to serve 10 to 20 years in Sing Sing prison with the right of parole, which Paul Vario took advantage of after a few years in prison. The next 25 years went by in a similar fashion for Vario. Twice he was released on parole, but time after time he was caught up in robbery and other crimes, and this again brought him back to the prison walls. Having served all the terms, Paul was released only in 1962. However, in the rather brief moments of his release, there was one significant event for him. Paul joined the Lucchese family. Upon his release in 1962, Paul immediately returned to criminal activity, immersing himself in the world of the American mafia. He had a phenomenal talent for making illegal money. It was his talent that he used to the fullest extent, participating in usury and bookmaking. He used the money he earned very cleverly and carefully, and even started a few legitimate businesses such as a flower store and a pizzeria. but it is believed that he did this only to launder the illegal proceeds. In addition to committing crimes, he managed to get married twice. He had 3 sons from his first marriage. However, one of them, Lenny, died on July 20, 1973 from severe burns. The cause of his injury still remains unknown. At Lenny's funeral, 2 television cameramen and a police detective were beaten. A short time later, Paul Vario led one of the Lucchese family's crews, becoming captain. Vario led a team that included his brother Salvatore, childhood friend Peter Killer Abondando, and Joseph Joe Dogs Iannuzzi, who had once been a mentor to the younger Vario. It was around this period that he would meet Jimmy Burke, who would become a partner in Vario's crew. Jimmy was known in narrow circles as a reliable, cold-blooded, cruel man who always kept his mouth shut and did not give up his associates. Noticing the great potential in the guy, Vario quickly took him in. For several months, Jimmy was engaged in beating money out of debtors and eventually brought his cruel business to a kind of mastery. Paul was finally convinced of his choice after an incident in which Jimmy himself beat a debtor almost to death, breaking all his bones, turning the man's face into a bloody mess, and leaving him disabled for life. He left him in exactly the condition in which he could continue to work and pay the bills because a dead debtor cannot bring income. In the matter of earning money, he was ingenious and resourceful in his own way as Paul. Seeing how his subordinate worked, Vario gave him his own usury territory, the center of which was located in Ozone Park. Burke, being Irish, could never become a full member of the family. But that didn't matter to Paul. Burke brought Vario thousands of dollars every month, and that was the most important thing. It was Jimmy Burke who had come up with the brilliant idea for enrichment. Employees at nearby JFK Airport were borrowing from Burke. After realizing that many people could not pay their bills on time, Burke realized that information could be worth much more than monthly payments. That's when he went to his debtors and made an offer they simply couldn't refuse. At stake was the cancellation of all debts of the man if he would provide Jimmy and Paul with information about the newly arrived expensive cargo. So, the airport workers became informants of the mafia family. Paul and Jimmy began robbing containers leaving the airport that were pointed out to them by snitches. Often they left a small amount of money for the truck drivers, thus expanding their network of informants. At one point, the mafia's influence at the airport became so strong that Paul's men went in on foot and took over $400,000. It turned out that most of the staff became hostages to the situation and not only could not prevent the robbers, but on the contrary, actively assisted them by opening doors and helping in every possible way. A similar situation will be repeated later. Only the amounts that will be taken by criminals will be, without exaggeration, more than 10 times larger. Of course, not without those who wanted to end the crime. As soon as Paul Vario received information that one of the employees decided to give them up to the police, he ordered the men to organize a show execution with which they perfectly coped. More often than not, the body was dumped in a car in the airport parking lot, sending a sign to all the snitches that they would pay the price for their betrayal. It may seem that for many years in the role of captain of the family, Paul got used to management work and lost all his fervor and aggressive attitude. But this is a misconception. Already later, his cronies will tell in interrogations that over the years, Vario became only tougher. A case in point was when Vario and his wife went to a local restaurant. That day, they were asked to observe the order of entry into the establishment due to its busy schedule. Paul waited outside for more than half an hour, watching as the newly arrived customers were immediately ushered inside. Even then, he was close to a breakdown, but he refrained from violence and expressed his indignation to the staff. This gave him and his wife a place inside the restaurant, but it also earned him the dislike of the waiters. During the service, one of the staff members allegedly spilled wine on the white dress of the mobster's wife on purpose. For him, it became the last straw. Paul jumped up, overturned the table, and began to beat the waiter. Because of Paul's large build, all the waiter could do was hide in the kitchen. Paul went there without a second thought, but he was stopped by a crowd of cooks with knives and pans. After assessing the situation, he threatened to bash the head in of anyone defending the waiter and left. The staff did not take these words seriously, turning a blind eye to the threats of one of New York's most powerful gangsters. It became a fatal mistake for them. Half an hour later, 2 cars arrived at the restaurant with Lucchese family men with baseball bats and metal pipes. Paul was very accurate in his warning. His men spent the entire next 24 hours searching for and brutalizing all the employees present that night. One of Paul's men would later describe it in the following words: "A great many heads were smashed all over Brooklyn that night." Vario was one of the most powerful gangsters in all of New York City and was involved in many of the illegal enterprises that existed in the city. Of course, law enforcement knew this and were on the hunt for Paul, wanting to expose one of the most successful criminals. However, it was nearly impossible because behind every honest cop, there were countless employees who were paid monthly by mafia families. There were rare occasions when Vario did end up in court, but he always got off with a light sentence. For example, on September 8, 1967, Paul admits to having bribed an officer. For such a crime, he should have received up to a year in prison, especially since he had previously served time. He should have been punished to the fullest extent of the law. However, the judge decided to fine Paul Vario just $250, even though he had a long list of arrests and prison sentences. And a day after the verdict, the same judge sent a 19-year-old with no criminal record to prison for 5 years for shoplifting. At the time, the NYPD was as corrupt as possible, and violent criminals were often covered up and released without jail time. Vario was so influential that it cost him nothing to pay them off. He was arrested a huge number of times for completely different reasons: betting, bribery, car theft, gambling, but he always avoided serious consequences. Paul Vario even owned a betting shop from which he made over $30 million a year, and investigators knew it but could do nothing. During the 1970s, Vario remained active in the criminal life, and he also faced increased harassment from law enforcement. After multiple cases of police bribery were uncovered, many officers were fired and a special unit was organized. Now, not only police officers, but also FBI agents were trying to catch him. All cases of Paul Vario were actively investigated. The officers collected evidence to later arrest and convict him. They used various methods including wiretapping, surveillance, and undercover agents. While undercover, the officers monitored what was going on at JFK's bar, because that is where Vario conducted some of his criminal business. The officers kept records of his visits, contacts, and any suspicious activity. They observed large sums of money appearing in the bar, as well as criminals passing suspicious boxes to each other, presumably containing money. Working undercover, the officers even had to set up a business selling Christmas trees across the street from JFK's bar so they could conduct surveillance quietly and not arouse suspicion. The cops tapped all the phone lines that were in the bar, as well as the junkyard, which was the second place where Paul ran things. The wiretapping was paying off. Law enforcement got a lot of information about betting operations and also regarding usury, but not a word about bribes was said over the phone. Then the police went to a very risky step. Guessing the right moment when the night shift guard of the dump would go out to eat, they put the dogs to sleep and installed a wiretap in the office itself. This allowed them to hear everything that was going on in the room around the clock. What was their surprise when they heard the voices of several high-ranking officials as well as their own colleagues discussing the size of the fee they were entitled to. After the investigation was completed and all the evidence was collected, the case went to trial. Thus, Paul Vario was once again in the dock. Despite the large evidence base, the prosecution made a significant error. The investigators did not take fingerprints from the banknotes used to pay the bribes to the corrupt police officers. It was this factor that allowed the defense to completely dismiss the corruption charges, reasoning that ironclad evidence was missing due to the negligence of the accusers. Of the many counts, only one remains, which the court recognizes as legitimate tax evasion. Parallel to these events, Jimmy Burke and another Vario ward were arrested by FBI agents for a crime committed in another state. They were on a business trip at the time and got into a fight with a man in one of the bars. Jimmy, already notorious for his inhuman brutality, lived up to his reputation again by beating the bar patron with the handle of his revolver. Unfortunately for the criminals, the victim's sister worked for the FBI, and upon arrival in their hometown, both criminals were arrested. Thus, Paul Vario and his accomplices are once again behind bars. Out of 10 years, they serve only 2.5 and are released on parole. Remembering the previous experience, Paul disappears from the radar of the authorities for 3 whole years. By 1978, Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke are both back on the loose and continue to live their former lifestyles. The money-hungry gang decides to commit a grand airport robbery. From his informants, Paul Vario learns that very soon at John F. Kennedy Airport will arrive a very valuable cargo. Using his connections among the airport staff, Paul obtained important information about the date and time of arrival of the cargo and instructed Burke to organize the robbery. On the night of the crime, 6 members of the gang, hiding their faces under masks, easily penetrated the airport and waiting for the moment when the cargo is taken out of the plane, pointed guns at the guards, then stole everything valuable and fled the scene of the crime. The group led by Jimmy Burke at Vario's direction managed to take possession of more than $5,875,000 worth of jewelry. After the successful robbery, Vario and his team were able to hide the stolen jewelry, cover their tracks, and avoid being apprehended by law enforcement. This crime was one of Paul's many feats in his criminal career, as well as the longest investigated case in the United States. The last arrests of the suspects occurred in 2014, nearly half a century after the robbery. Until now, the perpetrators have not been officially identified because Paul Vario killed all possible witnesses in cold blood, including those who helped him steal the valuable cargo. All the while, law enforcement continued to follow Paul Vario and his accomplices, and the efforts of the officers were rewarded. On September 14, 1980, Paul Vario was arrested at JFK's bar. Paul was charged with a number of crimes, including organizing a criminal enterprise, fraud, and extortion. Despite his reputation and connections, Vario was convicted. Paul Vario was one of the most influential and successful criminals of his time, but his career ended sadly. He remained in prison for the rest of his life and died of lung cancer on May 3, 1988, a New York State prison hospital. He was 73 years old. Paul Vario, despite his long criminal career and many arrests, remained one of the most powerful gangsters of his time. His story became a legend, reflecting the dark and complex sides of the New York mafia world. Vario passed away in a prison cell, but despite this, his name remains remembered as a symbol of brutality and the ability to evade the justice of the law. Therefore, if you loved the thrilling film on the life of Paul Vario, then you would love our film on how the notorious mob hitmen were hired by the mafia, and many of them are living their lives secretly around you. And if you want to know where they are right now, watch my next film popped on the upper left of your screen.